James Muraguri, good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
It's good to have you on Kenya's Biggest Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Karibu sana, it's been a moment. Karibia mic kidogo, ama uivute karibu na wewe. Yeah. Budget it nicely.
Wow.
James is the CEO of the Institute of Public Finance, and we want to talk about how we are performing. So these guys have gone home. What is that word? Sinadai.
Sinadi.
So Parliament has basically, the MPs
Right.
have gone home, unless they are called by the Speaker for something rather urgent and of great national importance. They will be gone, and some of them will not come back. Some of them are hoping not to come back because they want to be governors, like the chair of the Finance Committee. Others, like the deputy, like the minority leader, are hoping not to come back because they are not vying in this election. You know, they're looking at bigger things. Others are trying to get their seat back, and they will not get it. Anyway, they've just passed a number of things. The finance bill has been passed. There are several other things that they've passed. They've talked. They've looked at very many ways in which the next government shall have a rope to hang itself. And those are the questions that we want to discuss today as we look at how we have performed in terms of our budget in the last year. You've come up with a budget survey 2021. Tell us about it.
Thank you, Eric. The Open Budget Survey, which has been under process for the last 2 years, was trying to assess how transparent our budget has been within that period. It's been running for the last 8 years, and Kenya has participated on those 8 editions. And for this particular period, there were 120 countries that were being assessed. And Kenya scored, average, 50 out of 100, which is, it didn't move from 2019. And the contents there in looking at, how much information did government make available to public? How did the parliament allow for people to engage with them? And how did the Auditor General, look at our finances? And of course, across this conversation, even as you're talking about parliament and Senate, it's essentially the weakest link in this whole conversation. And I think it's something to make us all worry, when we think about parliament being the weakest link in our budget, in our budgeting process, because they're supposed to be, the proper oversight mechanism to safeguard public resources. So the Open Budget Survey, being, it's considered the world's only independent and comparative mechanism for assessing governments. Now, assessing 120 governments across the world and using the same criteria then means, Kenya at average, it's a pathetic average because we are properly beaten by Uganda, over the years. And considering, Kenya considered itself as, an economic powerhouse. It's just its own way of considering itself. Of course, the metrics might say it is, but when we think about budget and making this transparent, as a proper democracy within the region, then we need to be doing much better than we are.
James, can you walk us through the process? What are these indicators that you use in the survey, and what are they purposed to bring out?
So the Open Budget Survey looks at key budget documents. We essentially look at around 8 budget documents that are produced by government. This includes the budget policy statement. We look at the budget estimates submitted to Parliament. We will look at what Parliament approves or the Appropriations Act or the enacted budget. We look at the implementation reports produced quarterly, and we look at the mid-year report or half-year report, and then we look at the Auditor General's report, and then look at the finance bill, and look at the citizens' budget. So those are the 8 documents we look at, and each document, for example, we are looking at how has citizens or how has Kenyans been engaged in the process. If we're talking about the budget policy statement. We are asking, by the time the government submits that to Parliament, that Parliament makes a decision to put the ceilings and say, we expect to collect this much money, and we will spend this money this way. Has there been conversations that have been held? And these conversations have there, if you make, public participation, if you make a submission and say, we would want to be considered, for government to consider ABCD, does government give you response on whether they made that decision? And of course, like now, we saw people made feedback on the finance bill to Parliament, for example, made amazing propositions, and Parliament, the Finance Committee, took in suggestions and provided a report that indicated that, we've taken this feedback, but at the floor of the House, things change. But then, do we expect to get feedback on why those propositions were not considered? Then that's now when you talk about meaningful engagement or actually deliberation. There's, we're looking at trying to move the conversation from just mere public participation to actually public deliberations. Because if you move it to public deliberations, means there is feedback between you. We're deliberating. But participation, it could either be one way. Wanted me to participate. I participated, and that was the end of it.
Submit your memoranda, and then thank you very much. We shall put it in the report. You actually told us this. Now, this is what...
Yes. Absolutely. So that's a process that we take. We look at also the comprehensiveness of the information. We're asking, what information is this that's contained in these documents? Is it actually information that you can relate to, documents, like policy documents and other information available that is, that has evidence? We are saying, we're going to put, allocate, let's say 10 billion to Galana Kulalu. But what informs that decision? Is there evidence? Is there data backing up that allocation to Galana Kulalu? Is there a document that we can relate to that? In terms of, is there? Does it tell us how many hectares and what's supposed to produce and what would happen? To that end, because our budgeting has moved from line item where you say, I need fuel to go to Kisumu. Now it moved to a point where program-based budget we said, I need fuel to go to Kisumu to do A,
to do
B,
this
C.
and the other.
And these are the results that I'll find once I come back from Kisumu. Now,
do we get some documentation for some of these projects? Like the way you've said, pick one, like Galana Kulalu, X amount of money allocated to this. This is the reason, these are the supporting documentation, and this is what we expect out of it. And this is how we shall measure the impact of the 10 billion shillings that we're putting in. Do we get it in all items?
I suppose, first of all, that those documents exist, but if they're not made publicly available, we'll assess them as not being available. Because, at the end of the day, we're talking about taxes, which are paid by you and I, and, general all citizens. So if that document is not made publicly available, then it's considered not produced. So it will be assessed as not been, it's not there.
Okay, so then in terms of a budget, which we are saying must be efficient, it doesn't matter where we are in the world, that if you have a budget for which a country then is to operate, it must be efficient. So even as you look at this and you look at the Kenya example specifically, then how efficient is the budget? If you have participation, which is eye service at best, by the public, and then you have the budget then being implemented, as it were, based on decisions that will be made on the floor of the House, effectiveness and efficiency of the budget across board, how would you rate it? Just take this year alone. How would you then rate it?
Well, I would look at, first of all, from what parliamentary budget considered as allocative efficiency. There's no value for money in most of the things that we are doing, proposition. And while we will assess the efficiency and effectiveness of the resources being deployed, you want to look at, relate that to the actual quality of life. Are we changing life? And, it's interesting, over the last, 10 years or so, our budgets, we moved, potentially over almost 30 trillion plus, every year, if not so, of the annual budget, 2.5 to 3 trillion every year on budget. But then we're asking, what can we say? And heavy on it, it was infrastructure, public spending, so the concentration is high. It's at the top. So what translates to improved quality of life is then we can look at the effectiveness and the efficiency of the budget.
Sorry, James, aren't those then the factors then that need to influence? Because this budget, you know, oftentimes we look at the budget, it comes on said Thursday in the middle of the week. And then the assumption is that, you know, it was, you know, a couple of days before that this was done. But it's a process. It takes months and months and months of deliberation to do. Aren't these things that you're saying then factors then that should influence the decisions that are made during the process? You don't just make a budget because you need to do that for Treasury or for the country, but that I would assume that it is these factors: quality of life. Is life better year on year for the citizens of the country? Are we developing infrastructurally? Are we developing socially? Based on these elements, then is upon which you should budget, no?
Well, you know, that's interesting perspective, but we also need to ask ourselves, based on what we've seen over the years, what has been the key driving factor around our budget. Our budget, you know, while service delivery has been a component, it's been kind of a budget that's been driven by product-driven kind of process. You know, we plan to pladder, so it's, you know, we are budgeting to pladder, right? And of course, you know, the president himself said 2 billion is lost daily. Now you can imagine. And it's not lost daily illegally. It's legally lost because it's budgeted.
Yep.
And we'll follow all the processes. We plan for it. We know July is starting, so probably on 1st of July, there's 2 billion planned already, how it will leave. You know, so when you look, there's, of course, in the process of that leaving, there is a component of service delivery that's there, right? But the major is asking ourselves, what drives our budget making process? You know, it's, and I think the conversation we've been driving, as the institute and other stakeholders, is we've been trying to make that process a little bit more open. You know, don't give bulk figures and say, we're going to construct a road, 84 kilometers, costing 16 billion. Try to give a little bit more breakdown, so that also, even if it's the quantity surveyors and the engineers, they can be able to question those numbers beyond the bulk figure of 16 billion.
So in that sense, we've spoken about roads on the program before. The fact that government will morph and then not say, we're doing X, Y, Z. Like, for example, with this expressway that's been built, right next door. The planning documents, the design documents for that road, they're not publicly available. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I haven't seen any of them being made public, right? And it's not just that, because we keep being told we've built 10,000 kilometers of road, etc., 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 but where are the design documents? Because it's not simply enough to say you've built the roads at cost X. We need to be able to actually see what was designed and what was built. So in that sense, we're failing on transparency, aren't we?
Absolutely, we are failing big time on the transparency, and that you and I can't access those documents. Probably we're not looking at. There's a portal, I think. We are not looking closely enough.
You're not going to the portal.
In the portal closely enough. But it's a surprisingly Parliament.
Bundles.
It's .ke, not .com.
Yes. The Parliament actually last week, the report that it is the Public Investments Committee. It said they could not get the SGR contracts.
Yeah.
That's Parliament. That's
Parliament.
Oversight. And that's what I'm saying. Parliament. I mean, our weakest link in all this conversation has been because.
And yet legally, they have every right to get these documents.
Absolutely. Like, Parliament, they can put the government to stop and say nothing is going to happen beyond this if this does not happen.
Sure. But we will not approve. We will
nothing.
Nothing.
You see,
James, you just said that they could do it again?
Yeah. They could say, nothing's going to move.
This Parliament.
No, not this one. Like, I mean, the institution. The institution of Parliament.
In a real world, in an ideal world
we know where you're going with this
one. So, James, in an ideal world setting,
yes,
Parliament could actually put a halt to all of this and say, hold on, folks.
Yes.
Let's get this thing. Let's turn this caboose around and say, if you don't do or you don't show us how we're going, then what are we oversighting? What are we legislating on? What are we representing?
Absolutely.
We are not working if you are not providing us what we need.
Exactly. And of course, you can imagine, we're talking about huge amounts of money that has contributed to our, public debt, for example, and that those documents are not publicly, available. Of course, so we'll be told, expressway, it's not public debt, it's, it's private, it's PPP, but well, it's a, it's a guarantee, it's a take or pay.
There's the first P.
No,
It's public.
Yes.
How do you, what is public debt?
Yeah.
Must the government have borrowed on our behalf and done something or not done something with that money for it to be public debt?
Yeah, it must be, it must be essentially be received through our accounting system,
All right.
the consolidated fund.
So for it to be public debt. Now,
Yeah.
if we enter into a PPP, the government is part of that PPP,
Yes,
is it not?
Yes,
And the public that is being represented is us, isn't it?
absolutely.
So exactly, how is it then not? Anything that is without, then is it not
Well,
public debt?
they have argued strongly that the expressway does not get into a debt, but it's a guaranteed debt. Because if the expressway contractor does not receive the money, then the government has to find a way of paying the contractor.
And
It's
where does
essentially a take or pay.
And where does the government get its money from?
Yeah.
From us.
From
I mean,
us.
It's
So-
your money. There's no government money.
It's if you don't use the road
Yes.
and
Your
pay the
taxes.
contractor,
Yes.
you'll pay taxes to pay the contractor.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but just use the road.
Exactly.
Again, so I mean the simple question, so how is it then not public debt?
Yes, it is the argument that we need, and that's a conversation we need to keep challenging the authorities. Is we need to have the disclosure, proper disclosure, on this information. We need it. And
So in what format is your survey report? Does it look at critical factors and then give a rating and say this is where we are doing well and this is where we are not doing well and this is how come we are not doing well?
Yes, so there are three components. There is transparency, which is access to information, budget information across the 8 budget documents. There is public participation. How did the executive and parliament allow people to interact with the conversation on making decisions on that? And there is oversight, right? You'll find, parliament scores very well on participation.
Right.
Right, they call people, receive documents, and document. We received 173 submissions. That's proper. It's legal. They've ticked the box, right? But now, in participation with regards to them oversighting resources, there is no evidence within the time of survey where they asked a question with regards how are we implementing the budget. This quarterly report is publicly out because the Control of Budget and National Treasury will make the quarterly economic and budgetary review reports out, but Parliament committees responsible, none sat to discuss those reports. So even as our expenditure and us doing supplementary budgets, many supplementary budgets, it's not informed by Parliament, give feedback, and said you probably need to move money from this because you're not spending, but it's because Treasury thought, we not spend this, or we need more money, let's do a supplementary.
But isn't that part of the problem, though? The fact that we're having to bring up so many supplementary budgets in any given fiscal year. I mean, the fiscal years we've had supplementary budget 1, budget 2. Isn't that in itself a red flag? Because it basically tells you that government comes to the House, says we want to spend X amount of money over X period of time, and then we come back 9 months later and say, hey, by the way, we need to borrow more. I mean, it's a red flag.
It's a proper red flag, and ideally, what we've seen is supplementary budgets, needs to be properly challenged because it's a way of introducing things that we, that they know that public would have questioned
In the first
during the mainstream budget making process, right? And then again, they're able to increase, money. I think this time around, the cabinet secretary actually confessed and said I think that either the budget policy statement or one of the supplementary that we've overshot by what's required.
So it should not be beyond 10%.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But, he knows nothing will happen. I mean, there's no, really.
What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Mutadu,
He's actually told you, look, we've broken the law.
Yeah.
We've broken the law, but hey,
just bear with us.
Yeah. And we've brought you to you guys who make the law.
Yeah.
We are telling you the law.
So
that
we've
we
broken
make.
the law. We're asking you to pass this breakage of same said law.
Yeah.
To
And,
help us
we
not to
just-
break it again.
Isn't it a very low moment when you have a CS admitting to wrong, and the people who should have called him out are the ones who are being told about this, and they themselves don't seem to be calling him out?
Is it not a new law though?
It's a pattern, though, because if you actually go through some of the reports that come through from committees of parliament. So, like, for example, the one I'm looking at now, this is from the committee that Kanini Kega used to head, Budget and Appropriations. And they say, we approved that government can essentially spend X amount of money supporting KPLC, about 9 billion shillings, in order to cushion the company, because at the same time we're saying they need to reduce the cost of power.
Yep.
But, and this is from his report, the committee noted that whereas 7 billion, that 9 that we approved, 7 billion was used to actually cushion KPLC from the price reductions, another 2 billion was used to pay pending bills, which was not in line with what the National Assembly had approved. So, if you come to me as a taxpayer and you're telling me, oh, by the way, what we see is we approved X, government went ahead and did Y.
Yeah.
Okay, and then?
But it's okay, because that's the essence of all the reports by the Budget and Appropriations Committee always have some red flags. And I get a sense that they're taking this because the Parliamentary Budget Office has actually raised these issues. And because you know that the experts who are supposed to raise the issues have raised the issues, I've got to contain it in the report to show that, we worked with the information of the experts. But then the final recommendation is always, let's approve. Same thing. For the last how many years? 5 budgets, it's been financing the Big Four agenda.
Which is a mirage in
and
itself.
Parliament keeps asking, what is the Big Four agenda? What are the milestones? What projects are we financing? Why? Which one are we financing now? How shall we know the progress of the Big Four agenda? What is the implementation metrics? Each report from the Budget and Appropriations Committee questions this. But then they say, but Mr. Speaker, let's pass the budget. What?
It's utterly spineless. That's the long and the short of it. It's utterly spineless because you know that the things you're approving spending on do not make any sense. The data has been out in the public domain for a long, long time. You want to talk about affordable housing. How are you going to have affordable housing in a place where land prices are going completely berserk and you priced out an entire generation out of the housing market, right? Where you essentially pass a law that freezes or rather tries to impose price controls on lending. And then you turn around and say, oh yeah, no, people should go and get mortgages. What's your problem? See, we've controlled interest rates. Go and get mortgages.
Okay, we've created a mortgage financing corporation.
How? To whose benefit?
There's a mortgage refinancing corporation. In fact, it has very many people who are already subscribing to it. This is the future, all right?
And yet, we only have 27,000 mortgage accounts in this country.
In the country.
27,000.
However, Rama, you've got to look at it from just about 15 years ago, there were only 10,000.
Oh, sorry. There's progress.
There's a lot of progress. There's 17,000 new mortgage accounts in the last 15 years. That tells you, and we did not have the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Corporation.
So mortgage here, borrow money so that you can put up a structure to live in or for someone else to live in, isn't it? Yeah, but is that the sum total of all the development projects that we have in the country, 27,000? The answer is no. So where do these people get their money from since they're not getting mortgages? Because building a house is not 2 shillings.
It certainly isn't.
That's why we've noticed that the private sector in the financial sector is just not doing it. And that's why we've come up with this. The Kenya Mortgage Refinancing.
And the
Owned
fact
by who?
It's the public.
the banks
Which
and
public?
banks.
It's owned by the same banks. By the banks. It's owned by the
But
banks.
there's
Subsidized
public.
by the public.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Let's take a break. It's 26 minutes to 8. This is Kenya's biggest conversation, the Situation Room. We're having a conversation about budget and our budget making process. Open Budget Survey 2021 produced by the Institute of Public Finance, whose CEO James Muraguri is with us in the studio. Ramanyang is our guest host today. And of course, Nduoko is present. CT Muga is present. Eric Latif is somewhere.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
With you this morning is Eric Ndu CT and our guest host Ramanyang. For this, our guest is James Muraguri, the CEO of the Institute of Public Finance. We're looking at a Kenya Open Budget Survey 2021. It's James, that you look at very many documents: the budget policy statement, the budget estimates taken to Parliament, the Appropriations Act passed by Parliament, and then quarterly there'll be the implementation reports that are presented to Parliament by the National Treasury. There's the half-year reports presented by the National Treasury to Parliament, which will be discussed by Parliament. And then there'll be the Auditor General's report at the end. And then there's, of course, the Citizens' Budget, which is a abridged version of the budget itself. All those documents, when you look at them, where are the red flags? Is it at the first one, the budget policy statement? Is it the Auditor General's statement and how it's handled by Parliament? Is it the implementation reports and how they're handled by Parliament?
So the red flags will be on what we call the mid-year review, which is the half year. the half-year budget report, because first of all, it also informs, mostly the supplementary budgets come after the half-year. There's rarely none, any that comes before the half-year. So the mid-year review report or the half-year report, the version produced by Kenya is not consistent with best practices, because it doesn't give consolidated information across the whole half. So over the last 6-8 editions or so, it has been adjudged to be unavailable because it's not consistent with it denies people the information to see the decisions government is making with regards to that year, because then it can also allow Parliament to be more informed when the supplementary budgets are coming.
When you say best practice,
are
there provisions in the Kenyan law that match this best practice? Or could be the National Treasury is presenting to Parliament what the law tells it to present to Parliament?
And that's the biggest challenge we have, ticking of the boxes, not going. And that's what we're talking, including public participation, that you do public participation to tick the box. So when the law says you're supposed to provide a half-year report, the content therein is administrative. The law does not prescribe the content. So you're supposed to work. Actually, the law says, the quarterly reports will be made available to Parliament. And so the half-year report is 2 quarters, which is half-year report, and which is very administrative. So we're pushing them to give us more information on the decisions behind the half-year, so that even Parliament can be able to make the decisions. Because when you present now another quarterly report, with missing information of their previous quarter, then it means someone has to be reading 2 quarters simultaneously, try and get that, dig that information. But we want that information consolidated and matched against the targets,
And what does that push yield? Because the assumption could be that, yes, we know we are, curating all of this, and the assumption is that they know that they should then be made open or made transparent. The process. But obviously that doesn't happen. So what does the push yield? That you say, we're pushing them to be more transparent. We're pushing them to show us what this is all about, so that we know then the real state of things. What does that push yield? Or what has it yielded?
Well, we've seen information, gradually increasing in the document, right? And because if you look at 2017, the transparency scores was around 46. In 2019, it was 50, and now it's 50, right? Meaning there's some little bit of more information that has been improved. But because still, we'll assess what's in the document itself, but still the entirety of the document will be judged as not being available.
Oftentimes we ask questions here and they may seem obvious in terms of the answer. But the thing is that for those who are on the outside listening in, they would then need to understand, because it would seem kind of weird. Why on earth would anybody in a legislative capacity or an oversight capacity not want to share information about how things are done? Why?
Well, first of all, vested interests. People have vested interests. The more less information you have on how money is being spent, the more questions you're able to ask. The less questions you'll ask, because you have little information. But now people like Lamanyang, the less information you give them, the more questions they'll ask, because that's their daily work. The more or less information you give to James and the institute, the more questions you'll ask. So the better you give us information. The reason why, for example, we are, like harshly looking at this survey, especially for Kenya, because they're giving us less information. So we're asking hard questions. Why? Because we can dig much more information as experts in the space, but someone else will not have time to dig for that information. And they are the ones who pay the taxes. So you need to give them much more information so that they can be able to put the leaders to account for those resources.
Let me ask this question. This is just your opinion. Why do you think we have this culture in the country where information that should be in the public domain is always in the private domain? I mean, it's government. Why do we always have this conversation where we are asking for more and more information, which we are never given? Why?
Well, like I've said, like the contracts,
like the contracts,
like the budget numbers.
Like the designs.
The designs, right? Because if we, for example, we can ask, why would there be, if that design is available, we'll ask, why is it that there is no entry or exit from CBD.
Where there are no footbridges and
No footbridges.
Where there are no bus stops.
Exactly. Those questions we'll ask because we are users. This is the design, but what's the user experience?
Exactly.
It's the same case with the access to information.
In fact, Tim, the question is, was this the design? We see the so-called finished product. Was this the design?
Well, what we can see is the design, but what's the user experience? Because that's a question around access to
Was it
information.
factored? Yeah.
Absolutely. And if they made these designs publicly available, early enough, probably we could have challenged the designs and say, you missing point A, B, C, you missing point D and F, and that would have improved.
But let me ask the question, James, again. I thought it was enshrined in our constitution that a project such as this one should be subject to some thorough public participation. This one I know I haven't gotten wrong. This one I know I've gotten right.
Well, it's enshrined,
Yes.
And it's constitutional.
It's one of those situations of qua ground.
Yes,
And properly you say it's enshrined in the constitution.
it is.
Right?
It
And so
is.
it's an express
There's
order
an
from the people to the
environmental-
authorities.
There's an environmental and
But you
social
still-
impact assessment report for this one.
Yeah.
Kama wewe participate ni sawa.
Somebody participated
Kuna
on my
watu
behalf.
participate.
You see, yeah.
Where those people are, again, is a different question.
Might be random people on a ghost server
There you
somewhere.
go.
Well, and so abuse of processes and authority bestowed to those people by us as citizens, and the constitution, as you've rightly put, is something that's been rampant over the last few years.
Could you go into a bit more detail on that? Because especially with public participation,
Yeah.
it's a word that gets thrown around a lot by MPs, by government, and say, yeah, but public participation was held. And I've seen instances in specific laws, like the Copyright Amendment Bill that went to Parliament and was a huge flashpoint of debate last year, when they put out the call for, okay, now we want comments. It was in December, the tail end of December. People have turned off. They've gone home. Their mind is on full holiday mode. And then here MPs saying, yeah, we want comments for X, Y, Z. And you're giving guys a really, really tiny window. Could you give us examples of how that public participation process is abused?
Well, if I take it from a budget perspective, because we have precedent, I remember, I think in 2015, the Kiambu County Finance Bill was thrown out by the courts because there was no public participation. According to Kiambu County then, they had the judge themselves to have done public participation. But they invited people to discuss a revenue something, and then in the process, it sneaked in the finance bill for Kiambu County. Right? And they said, when people showed up, they said, we have this and we have this. But then people said, you said you were coming for this. And it's still the same thing. People have gone on holiday, and then you're telling them to show up. That time, and we've seen, great institutions like Katiba and TISA, for example, go to court on the question of public participation. Because public participation is not supposed to be a formality. It's supposed to actually be a proper qualitative engagement, between the process itself and the people. Yeah, which is what we've missed. But then, the narrower the time for public participation, then the less the time you have, for proper engagement.
And that's not cast in stone, is it? There's no set limit on, you must have this as a minimum, like 2 weeks or something of that sort.
Yeah. I think the only point, to say the entirety of the Parliament, when they do their own participation, when bills are published, when the bill can be introduced into a house, and when that's when the only timelines for participation for themselves. But for these other documents that are citizen, that require citizen engagement, there is none that has any defined period of engagement. And probably like the environmental assessments, which provide for 21 days, put in a newspaper and then 21 days. That's what that's defined, because that's now proper public participation. You can say it was put in the papers for 21 days. But for this, for legislative processes, we don't have any that has been given timelines that can be engaged in. So
by law,
yeah.
and I know I'm pushing the boundaries here. So by law, as Treasury or as the Finance Committee, I could sit down and conceivably say, here's the finance bill. I'm giving people 48 hours. Give me your feedback, and that's it.
Absolutely.
And that would be within the letter of the law. But it would not meet the spirit of the law.
Absolutely. And I mean, and we've seen where the period of publication of bills have happened, where they say, from 7 days to 1 day, and they will for example, Parliament would, write to stakeholders and say, we have a meeting coming up tomorrow or the next day morning. Please make your submission. Really, and it's happened. So, they've ticked the box in participation, and that's why we're saying the weakest link when it comes to these processes has been, for example, Parliament, because they've not provided. There's been a pending law on public participation actually in the Senate since 2014. I think that it was introduced by Senator Amos Wako, I think, if I'm not wrong. I think in 2014, and we're still waiting for that law on public participation, defining what should happen in the processes and timelines. But it's not happened, because if it happens, then it means people will have to follow through.
Maybe it's a good thing it hasn't happened yet, so that everybody then gets to understand what exactly we're talking about when you say public participation, so they can also better contribute to this particular bill.
It actually provides that actually the government sets aside money for civic education and public participation, because public participation is not civic education. When I come at my own participate, you need also to create time to come and educate us on what participation is all about.
Indeed. But then at the same time, then I think the question then beyond that, how granular does this have to be? Because the assumption is that you're going to, have, forums where people can come down, maybe read a document, and then they ask questions and they say they give their own. But then if we're really going to get what the mind of the people is, that means that it has to go to so many different levels. You have to translate, you have to, like you're saying, educate on subject matter. And isn't that where we see this really getting to the point whereby in other economies, we see that when you say public participation, it is so serious that you will not do anything without then the participation of the people. That's why where we have things like town halls, where you have right down to the lowest level of government representation, your ward representative or whatever is the one who is reading the thing and going through questions one by one. This is what it means, government. Then you have your experts who are also there in those said town halls. They don't care how long it takes until people understand, but they're not going to touch anything until it's been accepted and said yes or no.
It's interesting.
Is that the level that it must get to?
Not necessarily, because when people participate, let's say, for example, in Kwale, in Kinango, and if their participation is on the basis that we just come in to say we need water.
Yes. How you will bring it is really up to you.
You see, because they will come and say, in Msambweni you did a borehole, we want a borehole. Okay. Essentially, the problem is not a borehole. The problem is water. How you get them water will solve the problem.
Okay.
And if you look at our participation, we are far ahead, including of advanced democracies like Sweden, for example. But their transparency is way up there. So people don't participate because they know the people we've entrusted with the resources. If I send my email and say that we have a problem here, it will be fixed and I'll get a response, right? But in Kenya, if you send an email, the
link may be broken.
You've sent an email.
You've sent an email.
No, actually, you're going to be sending an email to a government official or other government entity, and the address is @gmail.com.
Exactly. Exactly. Right.
And it will not be considered official until you've printed it. It has been received and stamped received.
And you've gone back with your copy.
You've gone back with your copy.
That's how we mistrust. That's how we mistrust the process.
And when it's taken to the person now who's supposed to start actioning there, it has got to Uganda as a hard copy. So the person now writes their own notes there. James, act on this.
James,
so it's taken to James.
Rolled into one. What can we learn from other countries? Yes, let's not go too far. Uganda's just around the corner here. What can we learn from them? And secondly, the government that is coming in, what do you think, or in your opinion, should they look into? What should they do? So that, or what should they put in place that the discussion we're having is a far more positive one than the one we currently have?
Well, from Uganda, we need to make a little bit more accessible our budget information. Uganda is making more information publicly available, including reports and comprehensiveness. They're able to tell their citizens that we are going to spend money on this particular breakdown, and they're giving feedback. So that's one thing that we want to call our treasury, and they are engaging. Uganda is more engaging with citizens, as a Ministry of Finance than Kenya is. With regards to the coming government, they have literally zero fiscal space, to say so. Right. So first of all, we hope, we have a lot of hopes that actually they will make they'll make the mess they find publicly available so that we can be able to understand from where they are starting from.
You're very optimistic.
Right? Well, that's all the hope. You know, that's hope. You know,
The audacity.
Audacity of hope.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because come to think about it, and we saw, you know, debt being laced, you know, yesterday literally, or the other day. It means that they have that window of opportunity, and that they can be able to honor the laws, you know, and, you know, whichever presidential candidate, you know, wins. Because you notice, for example, between March and April, we've not made available information on how much we paid out for public debt. In fact, you know, as you know, interest, because as at February this year, in ordinary revenues, I think we had collected around 1.2 trillion, but we had spent around 600 billion on paying debts. But for March, April, and April, the information had not been made had not been made publicly available. And actually, the Treasury, in the Gazette notice that was uploaded in May, it is for February, meaning that between March and April and May, they are hiding something. Because in May they have uploaded the February copy in the Kenya Gazette. You see now that in regards to transparency, you call it mischief, but you can say it's an error, it's a typography, it's an error, uploading error. But the person who was uploading probably in the many Gazette notices.
And then thereafter, they never had an opportunity to fix things. Okay.
But you see, and I think that's how we look at the next government. They have got zero space to do the things. They have to make hard decisions, and considering probably our economy is properly, it's floating by a string that's being held by agencies like IMF and World Bank. We are literally not the ones in charge, because we've been living carelessly.
Fullizanomics.
Absolutely.
There's anyone.
Fullizanomics.
It finally comes to catch up with you when you live
And we expect the next parliament, the 13th parliament, to do better than the 12th.
Well, we hope.
Audacity of hope. There it is again.
Yes.
We are being told by the leading political formations, give me soldiers, 6 feet. So it's the same mentality that the executive will have. I want to have a parliament that I can use to run the government the way I want to run the government, not necessarily the prudent way of running government. Absolutely.
It's been unfortunate, but we are calling on the National Treasury to ensure that we are able to pick.
Is there a way in which we can enforce these things? Yes, I know we go to court, but the mindset of government, or those who are in government, or those who are in political leadership, seems to be tell the public anything you want, and then you go ahead and do what you want. Anyway, so we'll continue this conversation another day.
Yeah, but James, you can say, is there a way in 30 seconds?
Well, halfway, half, 50%. The next government has got to find it very rough.
Your glass is half empty, half full, half full, half full.
In fact, if you look carefully, there's no glass.
Get a strong opposition.
Absolutely.